Hello and welcome to the Armenian news network Groong Week in Review. This show was recorded on January 15, 2023. I'm Asbed Bedrossian and I'm here with Hovik Manucharyan, and here are the major topics we'll touch on today. We'll give a state of the Artsakh blockade and then talk about the unfolding politics in Stepanakert. We'll discuss the so-called press conference that Pashinyan held this past Monday at the same time as Aliyev held his press show. Then we'll talk about the appointment of the new Minister of Interior and how this new super ministry is coming along. Finally, we'll look back on the Armenian economy in 2022 and the outlook for 2023. To talk about these issues, we have with us Hrant Mikaelian, who is a political scientist and multidisciplinary researcher in social sciences based in Yerevan. He is also a senior researcher at the Caucasus Institute. Hello, Hrant. Welcome back to the show.
Welcome, Hrant.
Hello, thank you.
Great to have you on board. We all know that Artsakh has been blockaded by Azerbaijan for over a month now. This happens to be day 35. Last Monday afternoon, Artsakh's main power line connecting Stepanakert and Goris was damaged, and Artsakh Energo has still not been allowed access to the site of repairs to restore the service. So each day, there are rolling blackouts to make do with locally produced electricity only. In the middle of this past week, there was a 24-hour internet outage, but service was thankfully restored by Friday evening. And per our reports from Stepanakert in our previous shows that you are seeing on a daily basis on podcasts.groong.org, you know that supplies are low, food stamps are being implemented right now, and over 200 businesses have been shut down. And so a serious state budget revenue shortfall is expected as well at some point. So this is where things are standing right now. Turning to the politics in Stepanakert, 2 weeks ago and this past week, Artsakh President Hrant Mikaelian and State Minister Ruben Vardanyan announced new appointments to the cabinet. We're going to put the names in the show notes, but the key appointment was Sergey Ghazaryan, who is taking over the post of foreign minister from David Babayan. So the question is, Hovik, what do we know about Sergey Ghazaryan, except that he has the guts to take over this job at this very difficult moment in Artsakh's history?
I believe the only information I know is that Sergey Ghazaryan does have a history of being in politics in Artsakh as an MP a decade ago. He's also a senior member, I believe, of the Foreign Ministry of the Republic of Artsakh. And I believe most recently, if I'm not mistaken, he was in Yerevan at the Artsakh's representative office here in Yerevan, essentially the embassy. So other than that, I don't have any more information, but it remains to be seen how the purpose of these. I believe Ruben Vardanyan seeks to line up the cabinet with people he trusts to do a job and sort of from a clean slate. And then I also caught David Babayan's farewell Facebook Live, where he said basically that he's going back to politics. He's the leader of his own party. That was when I first got, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but that's when I first got a hint of some changes happening, because he said that if there are new elections, his party would participate in those elections, whatever that means.
Yeah, you gave us a hint of a question that I was going to ask. Why is there a need to shuffle all this cabinet right now? What are the reasons for it? And do you think that the main force driving this is Hrant Mikaelian or is it Ruben Vardanyan?
This is a very interesting question, because David Babayan and Vitaly Balasyanyan both were criticized for being first too pro-Russian and then non-professional. Well, it might be true, but it's a bit hard to find good professional people in Stepanakert, because the town is small and there was no good education school for political science or international relations there. So this is the main reason why it's hard to find well-prepared people for these jobs. And the fact that Stepanakert needs professional people appointed on this position is obvious, but to which extent the new appointees will be able to serve this goal, I'm not sure. And as far as I'm aware, these two appointees were put in their positions after the war, after the 2020 Azerbaijan's aggression, and it was kind of compromise with Russians. And now it might be that they were appointed by Hrant Mikaelian or maybe Ruben Vardanyan himself. we should learn more about it. And also, I can say that Artsakh Beglaryan could also serve in one of these positions, especially as a Minister of Foreign Affairs, but probably Ruben Vardanyan needed him more in his advisor.
Like a deputy almost.
Yes.
Yeah.
Speaking of people staying or leaving, we talked about Ruben Vardanyan's appointments, but how about Ruben Vardanyan himself? The matter is that rumors are surfacing that Artsakh President Arayik Harutyunyan might release Ruben Vardanyan as state minister. Vardanyan himself denied that he was going to resign after some leaks were placed in media saying that he was going to resign. And his statement also said that under the current circumstances, it would be unacceptable for the president or the parliament of Artsakh to resign, which was also part of that same leak. And he said this would basically fulfill the enemy's agenda. And Hrant, this is on Sunday. This entire weekend, I believe this news was on fire. What do you make of this information?
First of all, I want to remember how there were talks on possibility of having new president after the war, because many were sure that Arayik Harutyunyan should stay in power as long as possible, because Azerbaijan will not let a new election cycle in Artsakh. So as far as Arayik Harutyunyan was elected in 2020, it was not a big deal then, and still it's not a big deal. But now Azerbaijan is lowering the threshold and trying to affect the fact who will be the state minister of Artsakh. To be frank, not only him, Azerbaijan also affected who should have been the representative of Russian peacekeepers, and the general, which was more critical towards Baku, was dismissed from Moscow because of Aliyev's very active position. And they, in fact, gained a veto in these affairs. Now they are trying to do the same with Ruben Vardanyan, with State Minister of Artsakh. And in fact, Nikol Pashinyan is okay with it because the push came from Yerevan. And
Yes.
The question is about Artsakh sovereignty level and sovereignty from Azerbaijan, of course. And if Artsakh is able to withstand and to keep Ruben Vardanyan as a prime minister or as state minister, this is temporary good sign. And I hope Ruben Vardanyan will be able to handle this pressure, because of course at some point Baku will say that they are going to open the border if Ruben Vardanyan will be dismissed. It's not excluded that this type of statement will be there, and they will try to counter Artsakh's interests to Ruben Vardanyan's personality, which Baku has a track of doing so. So this is the direction where situation might go. But I can also add that not only the parliamentary structures or politicians, but also a wider population is welcoming Ruben Vardanyan, and many have hopes connected to him. Of course, some criticize having these hopes as well, because we have this tradition of messiah in Armenian politics, and it never turned out well. But hopes for Ruben Vardanyan in Artsakh, it's not the same as were hopes for Nikol Pashinyan in Armenia, because people in Armenia wanted better life, and people in Artsakh want to survive. So the agendas are a bit different. So to dismiss rather popular Ruben Vardanyan, it will not be very easy, I think. But now Ruben Vardanyan has also a clash with Yerevan in the separate track too.
Yeah.
Because of this online breach and because of some criticizing statements, which have started, by the way, in mid-December, when he stated that Yerevan is not helping much.
Mm-hmm.
He just states the truth. And the situation is that he is also trying to gain more subjectivity, more sovereignty as an Artsakh's leader. In fact, he is now at least the most popular leader, not maybe the most powerful, but at least most popular leader. So he has an obligation to say something regarding the Yerevan Stepanakert issue, which is misused in Yerevan and in propaganda in social networks. We've seen the start of these attacks in 2 days ago, and now they are still ongoing. So it's also noteworthy.
And to add to that, I've been following some of these social media battles, and the attacks against Ruben Vardanyan from pro-Pashinyan, very popular social media personalities, including Vartan Ghugasian, aka Dog, Some will say that he's not pro-Pashinyan, but I beg to differ. Anyway, it was a humiliating, like 5-minute, very embarrassing tirade against Ruben Vardanyan, and not like anything substantial, but just sort of trying to embarrass him. Meanwhile, another blogger by the name of Roman Baghdasarov touted this thesis that if Azerbaijan wants Ruben Vardanyan to go, maybe he should go, because then the blockade will open. So I just basically see these theses as straight from Aliyev's playbook, and I can't imagine this is all happening. In fact, like, all of the ecosystem of parties, of the extra-parliamentary opposition parties, such as Arman Babajanyan's party, his media, he has a very powerful media, for Arachin.am, are attacking Ruben Vardanyan day in and day out. And also, but surprisingly, there's also a lot of people in the opposition who are attacking Ruben Vardanyan for their own purposes. Some don't like that he's a representative of oligarchy. Some don't like that he's an outsider to Artsakh. I think it can be said that Ruben Vardanyan basically has been able to take everyone by surprise in terms of the political board in Artsakh. Yes, from one perspective, to me, at least personally, if Aliyev and Pashinyan are against Ruben Vardanyan so much, then maybe maybe there is a reason why, and both of them don't recognize Artsakh's independence. That's a fact.
Hovik, I actually had a question about this. If it is the case that Vardanyan has suddenly inserted a spoke in the Aliyev-Pashinyan so-called agenda of peace.
Look, I don't know, and I think it's still too early to make anyone a hero. I think it's still too early to say where things will fall, but I think we're just sort of stating the facts, and I don't know enough to say that, hey, this is what's happening. But at this point in time, just from an external politics, right? If you look at, Aliyev is demanding Ruben Vardanyan step down, and if he steps down, then Aliyev will get what he wants from in terms of external policies. Now, internally, everyone can be against him for whatever reason, but to me, the external appearance of it will be very telling, and it'll be a point one for Azerbaijan, another point one for Azerbaijan, and for Aliyev.
Yeah. Hrant, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I want to add a couple of things. First of all, it's that Ruben Vardanyan is popular not only in Artsakh, but in Armenia too. There was an opinion poll in Armenia, like in early December, by MPG, and we've seen that about 60% of people support or have trust towards Ruben Vardanyan, which is as of now the highest support rate. So they might spoil it. They are doing that. So probably the rates will decline, but not very fast. Now, considering the oligarchy and so on, at least we know that Ruben Vardanyan did not become wealthy person in Armenia. And even in Russia, he became wealthy person not by just robbing, but in finance sector, which of course can be doubtful somehow, but comparing biographies, it's by far better than most of those who became billionaires at the time. Now, considering the situation, I also agree to Hovik that the issue is that now it's a matter of Artsakh's subjectivity. Whenever they talk about dismissing Ruben Vardanyan, it's not only about personality, but it's also about the institution. Now, regarding personality, and this is a major reason why they criticize Ruben Vardanyan, it's that it's about competition. Many opposition parties in Armenia, and probably Vardan Ghugasian too, I'm not sure, but it could be so as well, see him as a very strong competitor. And it should be said that Ruben Vardanyan was trying to find a way towards Armenian politics, like for a long time. At least I've observed this try since 2016. And in 2022, he found a way towards Artsakhi politics. And it can be said that it was one of the best points to intervene, let's say. So that's what he did. And also, he took enormous amount of responsibility, which also should be taken in mind. So as of now, it's again not only a personal story of one politician or one person which is even new to politics, but also an institutional story. And also, as far as I know, it's a way how Ruben Vardanyan is trying to handle that as well, because he held a big event in Artsakh prior to his appointment, like in late October, where many diaspora and Armenian representatives came to discuss issues regarding Artsakh's future, and there were several time frames, 2025, 2033, and so on. So people were discussing futures, they collected many ideas, and maybe they will try to implement some.
Okay, let's turn our attention to Yerevan now. Nearly a dozen press and media outlets were left out of the invitation list to attend Nikol Pashinyan's press conference this past Monday. The Union of Journalists of Armenia called on Pashinyan to rectify the situation and allow access to all media news outlets equally, but that was not the case. So it seems like this press conference was actually mostly a stage show for Pashinyan to make statements in the form of questions that he wanted asked in order to give prepared answers for them. Also notable was the fact that Pashinyan and Aliyev held their major press conferences on the same day. So Hovik, maybe next week we should talk about Aliyev's statements and press conference.
On that note, actually, it was not only on the same day, but at the same time. And
Yeah.
That's a good question we should ask Hrant, because a lot of the talking points were also the same. And it seemed very much like, to a naked eye, it seemed like a very coordinated event. So I wanted to get Hrant's opinion on whether this was sort of pre-agreed between the two.
I think it's not only the two. Most probably there is some hidden negotiation track which cannot be observed by naked eye, by the open information, because to coordinate some media statements, they don't need to hold it parallelly. Most probably there is some external actor who is the main receiver of these statements, because as I assume, these statements were made for the foreign audience, for the diplomatic and political audience, and I agree that Pashinyan's statements were formed in a form of questions, answers, but it was completely staged, and I'm not even sure that Pashinyan was preparing these statements. At least these were coordinated with his foreign partners, and by the way, also he paid a lot of attention to make them seem much more adequate compared to what he usually does, because the form of his answers, the form of his speaking was much more civilized than it usually is. And it's also interesting that this time media did not ignore his press conference, because the topic was important, because it's about Artsakh, but he misused it and ignored some media on behalf of himself.
Right.
And I'm sure that either most of the questions or vast majority of the questions were staged.
So Hrant, actually talking about the talking points that Pashinyan mentioned, one of the things he said is that Armenia is using its quote-unquote diplomatic toolkit to put pressure on Azerbaijan to open the Lachin corridor. Now, if you ask me, it can be said that Armenia not only doesn't consider using force to secure Armenians of Artsakh, but it's refusing to even prepare for a coming war. Do you think that a diplomatic toolkit, whatever that is going to be sufficient to force Azerbaijan to open the Lachin corridor?
First of all, I'm not sure that Armenia is using all of its diplomatic capabilities to counter Azerbaijan's illegal pressure on Artsakh. So, starting from diplomacy, we already have big troubles here, because statements issued once in a week, it's not a thing. It's nothing. And blaming Russia is not a strategy to make Russia work. And blaming the abstract international community also will not in any way help Artsakh. You cannot just blame people. You cannot just criticize Azerbaijan publicly and say that it's a diplomatic toolkit. And if there is something else, we should see how it goes. I think, well, there might be some consultations and so on, but in general, the diplomatic activity is made in form of meetings, in form of coordinated statements, in form of, let's say, external actors involved, and that's what we generally don't see. And even we have seen resolutions by French and Uruguayan parliament, and even there we did not see any response from Armenia.
But they also do not affect the outcome on the ground. I mean, the French can make any resolution they want. Uruguay can make any resolution they want. But if Aliyev decides to further tighten the blockade, nobody can do anything with these resolutions.
I completely agree, but resolution is a political position which can be then developed to something else, for example, Uruguay can push some agenda in the Latin American level, and France can do something else except to just statements. But for that, you need very intense diplomatic work, which I don't see. I don't see because if there was a track on, for example, phone connections and so on, especially regarding some publicly important issue like Artsakh, not like resolving something which they don't want other people to know, but in fact, the contrary, they want to know people that they are doing something. I think we would know that. And that's what we don't see. That's the first thing regarding diplomacy. The second thing is that diplomacy is very strictly connected to the humanitarian law, and humanitarian law is a law regarding the war. So dispatching diplomacy from the military solution is impossible. And here we can also remember Churchill said, if you choose between humiliation and war, humiliation, you'll get the both. So this is what we're getting. Now, to counter Azerbaijan's pressure, it's impossible to not use military force. Now, of course, we don't want to have a war and so on, but it's not a thing we can choose. Azerbaijan has put it very strictly that the issue is not Artsakh, but the issue is the whole Armenia, including the last village of Shirak, which is far away from Azerbaijan, but they claim the whole territory of Armenia. It's Aliyev's statement made by himself and also a program article which was published in Hakinaz and then spread among foreign publics as well. And also it's probably intended to make an attention in Armenia as well. Now they are telling us that you will not be able to avoid the war. And these tries by Pashinyan or his supporters or people who think like him or who have similar approaches to avoid the war by even by, let's say, selling Artsakh, which is in this time correct statement, it will not work. It will just not work. So this is what Aliyev says in reality. Now, how we perceive it and how we react, this is the issue. So, of course, diplomacy is a tool for the state. Military is also a tool for the state. But military is also a tool for diplomats, because when diplomats talk, they say, in, for example, negotiation theory, there is a thing like BATNA, best alternative to negotiated agreement. So the thing is, what is your alternative if you don't agree? For example, you can have another agreement with another country. For example, you can have military solution, or you are ready for military solution. Azerbaijan's BATNA was always a war. In reality, starting from 1994 or especially 2014, not talking about now, because now Azerbaijan is threatening war like there is no tomorrow. Now, considering that situation which we have, we should leave Azerbaijan without this option. This is the only chance Armenia can survive. And of course, this is also a diplomatic tool. But what I wanted to say is that even diplomatic tools are not being used or not being used properly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another major topic at the conference was Armenia's relationship with the CSTO. There were some, I guess, allegations that Armenia had threatened to leave the CSTO if Russia did not open the communications on the Bertsor or Lachin corridor. Pashinyan said, he denied that Armenia had threatened to leave the CSTO. But at the same time, Pashinyan said that Armenia had declined to host CSTO military exercises in Armenia in 2023. And the Russian defense minister, I believe, came back and said that they were not aware of this announcement. And at the same time, like many other Pashinyan officials, such as Alen Simonyan, for instance, always says that, it's not Armenia leaving the CSTO, it's the CSTO leaving Armenia. What is really going on in Armenia's relationship with the CSTO? How are we supposed to sort of understand these statements?
Let's start from basics. They say that Russia has an obligation to react in Artsakh and in Armenia too, which is true. But the but is that there is no mechanism which forces you to make a decision if you don't want to. You will always find justification, just as Russia does right now. Not only that, any of military solutions which are being imposed by the allies are politically motivated. So if Russia has political motivation to react, it will. If Russia does not have political motivation to react, it will not. It's obvious. And not only it refers to Russia, but it also refers, for example, to United States, whenever they react to, for example, attacks against Israel. They might react and they might not react. And we have seen both cases. Now, the situation is that with this, Russia is very predictable. And to be frank, Russia's foreign politics is not governed well. And it's very easily provocable. Now, what Pashinyan does with this kind of statements, he's getting harder and harder line towards Russia. What is he doing with this is that over time he reduces the credibility of Russia's response towards Azerbaijani aggression. What they think in Russia? Well, Armenia is a small country with no choices. So if they talk against us, let them face the consequences. And the more Pashinyan makes anti-Russian statements, the less is the credibility of Russian reaction. Okay, we don't want Russia to react.
In fact, just to add to that, he also, and this is the bombshell, he said basically that the Russian base in Armenia, the 102nd base in Gyumri, essentially, is a liability. It may be a security liability for Armenia, basically, essentially throwing a trial balloon about Armenia's essentially asking the Russians to leave, which has generated a lot of reverberations in the news and analytical community.
Yes, right. The Russian base was also discussed. And generally, what do they say, especially himself? He says, okay, Russians do not react full scale, then let them not react at all. When he puts Russia in this all or nothing choice, Russia will react as nothing. That's what is his expectation. And then this means that he gains more, let's say, motivation and more legitimacy towards moving Russia out of Armenia. That's his strategy. And he is going there for already a long time. And speaking about Russia leaving Armenia on behalf of itself, it's mainly about that. Not only that, of course, there are problems on Russia's side, of course, but it's external issue. We are discussing what Armenia does, and this is important to my opinion. When he puts it in a way all or nothing, we should understand that small country representatives puts to the corner the big country representatives, which big countries always refuse. And I think the major part of diplomatic solution towards the situation in Latin Corridor would be talks not just to the international community, to the West, or to the United Nations, but to the regional powers like Iran, like Russia, like India, like Arabic countries, and France as well. Now, those countries which are more or less involved in this region, if you outmeet that, of course, you will not get any solution to the issue. And in reality, and which is more important to me, is that he spoke on Artsakh. He left Artsakh without any chances to be independent. He says, nobody has rejected Azerbaijan's control and Azerbaijan's legitimacy over Artsakh, which is completely fake. The fact that Minsk group has existed already shows that world did not recognize Azerbaijan's sovereignty over Artsakh. Minsk group was created to resolve the issue of status of Artsakh, and not only was created, but still has this mandate. And not only that, even the talks between Armenia and Azerbaijan, nevertheless, Azerbaijan and Armenia leaders coordinatedly say that there is no Artsakh issue anymore, which Pashinyan does the very same level almost as Aliyev. Still, there is an issue. First of all, that's why they make these statements, but also it's about the fact that there are talks, there are discussions, and there are negotiations. And what these negotiations are about, if not the Artsakh issue? Well, of course, there is a long list of issues, but this is the first issue. And that's why his statements are fake. But based on these statements, he wants to close the Artsakh question and to remove Russia from Armenia. So his goals are obvious. They catch up with Azerbaijan's goals very well. This also should be said. And by the way, Pashinyan always got support from Turkey and Azerbaijan, at least on the public level, when he was criticized or attacked in Armenia. We can remember the statement of the general staff in Armenia when many Turkish public figures directly supported Pashinyan. And the last time Pashinyan got support from Turkish leadership was in late November 2022, when Erdogan came to Zangilan and spoke on Pashinyan, that he is very constructive, he's very good for Turkey, and that only opposition and diaspora are against this so-called solution. So generally, I see this anti-Artsakh and anti-Russian movement as a whole, which is externally motivated by the goal of removing Russia from the region and internally motivated by closing the Artsakh question.
So, Hrant, given what you just said, I'm going to guess that this is what Pashinyan is talking about when he's saying that it is time that Armenia must change its perspective on regional political orientation. Is it a pivoting from Russia to Turkey, basically?
In reality, yes, because there are many people, including those American Armenians, who speak that, oh, the West will provide Armenia with everything needed, the West will remove Russia and take the position itself, and so on. In reality, there will be no West here. This is like 100%. The West is not directly involved in Georgia in any way. There is no Western soldiers in Georgia. How can they be in Armenia?
Right. The hand of the West in the South Caucasus is Turkey, basically.
Let's add up to that a couple of more things. West has left Afghanistan, which is a very important story because
Right.
Afghanistan is a Central Asian country, and which basically geographically, Armenia is also a Central Asian country. At least it's far from the sea coast. And in many international brochures, South Caucasus and the Central Asia is viewed as one region. And generally, it's a region which is far away from the sea, from the world ocean, and by the way, far away from Europe. At least Europe as a European Union, at least from political Europe. And restraining from Afghanistan meant that the West is not going to spend resources in the heart of Eurasia. And this logic will apply to South Caucasus as well. And now coming to what you have said about Turkey, it's not only that Turkey is the main player of NATO in the South Caucasus, but the main objective for the West is confronting Russia and Iran, both in South Caucasus and Central Asia. And for that, you don't have any other tool than Turkey and Azerbaijan.
Right.
So obviously, in the West, they have considerations regarding humanitarian situation in Artsakh, but politically, they will support Turkey. And the more Pashinyan is playing his role, the less motivation they will have to do anything except that. Because if he approaches Artsakh issue as an internal issue of Azerbaijan, which he says Artsakh should have dialogue with Azerbaijan, and why Azerbaijan has always refused to not let any connection to Artsakh sovereignty, but now they are trying to impose vertical relations between Stepanakert and Baku, and Pashinyan is supporting this approach. So he wants to stop Armenian support towards Artsakh. He wants to essentially give up Artsakh to Azerbaijan. This is what is going on, and this is what we can understand from his statements. He said it in any way. And now the issue is how to do that. Still, Russians are there, which means you cannot just take Artsakh to Baku. You should also remove Russians out of there. And this is what he's doing, because if he cared about Artsakh's blockade, he would do something about it, but he does nothing. And that's why the statements that Russia is doing nothing towards Lachin, and this is why the military exercises are abandoned, it's just not true.
Yeah, it's just basically fixing the blame on somebody else.
Yes, we have a place to criticize Russia, but first of all, we should criticize ourselves. And the day we have done our best, I mean, we as Armenia, the day Armenia has done its best to reopen this corridor and no one else is doing, or Russia is not doing, or something else, then we have a right to criticize anyone else. That's my approach. And I think talking about someone else and not talking about own issues, I think it's a nonsense. That's why generally the issue is Pashinyan's approach, not Moscow's approach. And Moscow's approach is heading towards a less and less pro-Armenian and more pro-Azerbaijani approach. It's also because you can remember when Hrant Mikaelian refused to go to Moscow, and Lavrov had a meeting with Bayramov and criticized Armenia.
And Lavrov was furious.
Yes, and generally what they do, they make Russia furious of Armenia. Then Armenia faces the result of this fury, and then they say, look what Russia is doing to Armenia. This is their very simple tactics. Of course, it's also because Russia's foreign policy is very easy to read and to predict, but this is what it is. But we need to understand the intentions of current de facto government of Armenia, and this is what they do. So removing Artsakh agenda out of Armenian agenda at all, and removing Russia from Caucasus will, of course, mean Turkish influence over Armenia, and it's already growing by a big portion because Turkey and Azerbaijan have been involving in Armenian affairs for a long time already. These last 2 years, they are completely inside. They are affecting many things, and they are one of the reasons why Pashinyan is still in power. So it's obvious that he is supporting them. They are supporting him. So if it quacks like a duck, I don't know what else can I say.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's switch the topics a little bit. In December, the parliament approved a proposal from the Ministry of Justice to consolidate police, rescue, I guess the Ministry of Emergency Situations, and the immigration services into a new Ministry of Interior. Last weekend, Pashinyan named his new Minister of Interior to be his childhood friend from Ijevan, Sergey Ghazaryan. And the move was widely criticized by the opposition as well as civic groups and international NGOs. What are the ramifications of this appointment? And is all this criticism just like another episode of political infighting, or is there something that you see wrong with this move?
Well, this Ministry of Interior agenda they had from the beginning. Let's say, I remember the talks on that within the government, at least starting from the autumn 2018. Maybe they have started it even since the May 2018, so from the very beginning, but at least from the September, October 2018, I was fully aware of that. And they have been preparing this reform, and now it was finalized. It's interesting that Armenia had a Ministry of Interior during Levon Petrosyan's era, which was then divided into several services during
Vano Siaderian, right, was the infamous head of that ministry.
Yes, right. Okay. And by the way, in reality, they usually say that Levon Petrosyan is the political father of Pashinyan, but in reality, it's Vano Siaderian. Yeah, and right. Now they are recreating the Ministry of Interior, which will be another super ministry. We have seen several super ministries. One is the Ministry of Education, which is now including several other ministries. Another is the Ministry of Territorial Administration, and which includes, for example, the most of the Ministry of Transport and Communications, which has existed before, the Ministry of Energy, and some other services. And now this one, which will be another super ministry. I don't see the strict institutional logic behind that. Maybe, I don't know, something most probably. But putting Vahe Ghazaryan there is a very clear move, because Vahe Ghazaryan has saved Pashinyan during the last several waves of protest, and he has been imposing more and more authoritarian behavior of police, where more than 1,000 people were detained, like in protests in the spring 2022. And now, by the way, other activists, Sasna Tzer activists who were protesting against Russians, some of them were also detained. So whatever Pashinyan needs to do, Vahe Ghazaryan will do. So I think this is the proof that it will become another political tool in hands of Pashinyan. But in reality, what does it change? I don't know, because the services which are being united within this ministry have been already there from the beginning. I mean, they have all been under Pashinyan's control. Yeah. Maybe there will be more direct control. Maybe, as I say, the police will be more. For example, they legalize this move by saying that police, which is part of the government, is more transparent because it's already participating in government meetings and so on and so on. Some regulations are put over police after it's part of the government. I cannot comment strictly on that because I'm not fully aware of this situation.
By government, do you mean parliament?
No, I mean the executive government. I mean
okay.
cabinet of ministers.
Yes, because also one argument I heard for this is the minister will be accountable to the parliament and will be the parliament will be able to call him for hearings, and he is obliged to then appear and respond. Whereas previously, I guess at least for the police forces were directly subservient to Pashinyan. I mean, at least that's one of the official things to do. But if that's the point, if that's the reason to do it, then I don't know why Pashinyan made another reform recently, where he took the Պետական Պաշտպանության ծառայություն (PPC) out of the National Security Ministry. So in one area, he's consolidating everything into a formal ministry. Another, he's dismantling a ministry and moving services from that ministry into his own structure. So at least it doesn't seem to be consistent in terms of the approach. What do you think?
From the point of view of institutional logic, it is inconsistent because, if you want, for example, if his approach would be big institutional entities, which include many services and more vertical structure and more unified structure, because, for example, migration service was out of any ministerial structure, it was separate structure, and as well as many other ministries and so on. But here is another issue, which is that what you said would be the institutional logic. Now, Pashinyan's logic is political logic. He likes idea of Ministry of Interior, which he completely trusts, but there is, for example, General Staff, which he completely mistrusts, and also the same refers to the National Security Agency, which he does not trust at all, because some of the officers have got Russian education, I mean the security officers, and also he does not trust this service because the service is institutionally connected to the previous governments as well, and that's why he wants to destroy the service and replace it with another one, but he is not ready to create a new one yet. But as far as I'm aware, the works on that are ongoing for already like 4 or 5 years. So in reality, they are preparing another reform to create another security entity and to close this one. That's why taking some internal structures out of it and merging it with some other entities or putting it under Pashinyan's direct control has this political logic, not institutional logic.
Let's turn our attention to a topic that we like to talk about with Hrant. That's the economy of Armenia. In his press conference, Pashinyan said that for 2022, his government had predicted and promised a 7% economic growth, but due to the effects of the war in Ukraine, something around 12 to 13% was achieved. In fact, I kind of recall that his Minister of Economy had promised a double-digit growth, but anyway, that was achieved, 12 to 13%. For 2023, Pashinyan expects 7% economic growth again. The World Bank has said that it expects 4.1% economic growth in Armenia. Hrant, what does the Central Bank of Armenia expect, and what do you think is possible, or what do you think is reasonable?
Well, let's start with, as you said, Ministry of Economy. In reality, Hrant Mikaelian expected two-digit growth in 2021, and his expectations were based on two factors. One of these should have been the recovery growth after the collapse in 2020, where economy contracted by 7.2%. And another would be opening of borders with Turkey, which he expected to bring a lot to Armenian economy, which we have discussed that it's not going to happen, but at least in his mind, it was like that. In reality, 5.7% economic growth in 2021 was achieved, so much less than he said. And by the way, none of the medias which have retranslated this statement have questioned him about it. And now regarding the issue of the economic growth in 2022, if I'm not mistaken, the government's expectation was about 5%. So at least that's what I remember from the project of the budget for 2022. When we say government, we don't necessarily say Pashinyan. because when we say government, it's also a bureaucracy. Now, head of government, Pashinyan himself, yes, he was saying that 7% economic growth is there. And by the way, 7% of economic growth, where this figure was born. In 2012, after an economic crisis, when Armenian economy also collapsed in 2009, in 2012, Armenian economy first have recorded a rather good economic growth of 7.2%. And then Serge Sargsyan stated that he is expecting that 7% economic growth will continue in the future as well. And when in 2013, it was much lower, like 3.5 or something, and the figures were published in late February, then in March or early April, he dismissed Tigran Sargsyan and appointed another prime minister. Now, we can remember how Serge Sargsyan once said that Armenia will have 4 million population in 2040, and then Pashinyan has said that Armenia will have population of 5 million in 2050. The very same issue comes here. So Pashinyan's internal competition with Serge Sargsyan is coming from there, and there the 7% figure was born. It has nothing to do with government, because there is no government document which includes this figure, which includes 7% growth. It's only Pashinyan's personal statements. Now, considering current economic growth, initially it was like around 5% or 5.5%, if I'm not mistaken. The budget project was including, and there was even a clash in the Ministry of Finance, which is creating these projects, because they viewed this 5.5% even as a too high figure, because generally Armenia's economic trend is 4.1 to 4.5% in the long term. That's why, for example, World Bank is expecting 4.1 in 2023 and 4.8 in 2024. So generally they use this logic as well, and generally this is the logic for central bank and for Ministry of Finance as well. And in most of their expectations or prospects for Armenian economy, they cite this kind of figures. I don't remember the exact figure they have for 2023, but it's not so important. Now, when the Ukrainian war has started in February, there were expectations that Armenian economy will start contracting because of that. Because, for example, in 2014, anti-Russian sanctions had affected Armenian economy, but the situation was different. Yes, in March it affected Armenian economy. There was some decrease in economic growth, but since April, Armenia has started facing the significant influx of Russian immigrants. Well, in reality, some started coming since late February, but since April, the number has started to become significant. And in addition to that, since late May, there was influx of Russian finances to Armenia. Some people decided to open a bank account in Armenia. Some financial operations were held through Armenia, and even some portion of foreign trade of Russia.
Right.
Because I can say that in autumn and winter of 2022, Armenia's export to Russia has increased like 4 times or something, or 3.5 times. So obviously it has nothing to do with goods produced in Armenia. It has to do with goods traded through Armenia. So if we don't go into much into the details, we can say that this sanctioning against Russia, Armenia has benefited from this policy.
Yeah.
And in addition to that, I can say that, for example, at least since June, Armenia is getting a net 200 million US dollars through bank transfers to Armenia through Russia.
Yeah.
Well, from Russia, we have plus $300 million, and then minus $100 million we have to other countries, which means most probably that Armenia is like an intermediary direction for these transfers. But the rest, $200 million, stay in Armenian economy, which has resulted in increase of dram rate, although I was and I am still criticizing this decision. But at least this is what we see. This is how it affected Armenian economy. And in reality, most probably this year we will have not even just 12 to 13% economic growth, but most probably 14, or even as high as 15, but most probably around 14, 14.2 or 14.4, something about this figure. which means that it will be the highest recorded economic growth in the 30-year history. And of course, when the figures will be published, like these figures are being published, if I'm not mistaken, on 25th of February, this will become another point for Pashinyan's propaganda. But to the biggest portion, this growth was caused by the Russian influx. At least from transfers, Armenia got about 10% of GDP additionally. And then about 6% of GDP additionally, Armenia got from the influx of Russian citizens to Armenia. Most probably these two figures are connected to a big portion, but still, I think at least half of this 14% economic growth, which I expect for 2022, is connected to Russia. And the rest is to big portion connected to the recovery growth, which was not fully recorded in 2022, 2021. So in reality, nothing like Armenian miracle was recorded in 2022. It's just several events or several issues which are not directly connected to any policy which was imposed in Armenia have affected Armenian economic growth.
Yeah, essentially luck. I mean, if you can call that, because the same thing that caused this economic growth, the war in Ukraine, is seriously affecting the outlook of Armenia and Artsakh, geopolitically speaking. So
Hrant, what is your expectation for 2023?
It's hard to say anything yet because we don't have even data for December 2022. So I'm not very good in long-term prospects. Generally, what I can do is forecasting for 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
Why I'm doing that for Armenia? Because in reality, situation in Armenian economy changes like in a 6-month time frame. And I don't see current trend continuing until the end of 2023.
Mm-hmm.
So generally, I can say that economic growth will be most probably significantly lower than in 2022 for two reasons. One reason is that there will be no low base effect like in 2022. And if the war in Ukraine stops, and if sanction pressure on Russia will decrease, this might result in decrease of these financial operations through Armenia. And also, I had an expectation of immigration in Armenia of 61,000 people in 2022.
Mm-hmm.
But recently, we have observed that this number is lower at around 48,000. It might change because it's based on a rolling 12 months from December 2021 to November 2022. But still, most probably the figure will be around this 48,000. So the rate of immigration is not as high as I expected. I expected that there will be another immigration to Armenia in 2023, which is not a fact because some immigrants might even leave Armenia. So I think the economic growth in Armenia is completely unpredictable for 2023. It might turn out to be like 5%, might be 8%, but it might be as low as 0 or something. So I don't expect any.
We also don't see any abatement of the sanctions against Russia in 2023. Right now, they're just ramping up. A couple of things that came to my mind. In 2022, we had near 10% inflation in Armenia. If the economic growth was 13%, does that mean that the real growth experienced by people was about 3%?
Well, the inflation figures are always tricky for economic growth because some of indicators don't include inflation rate. Some others do include. For example, if you hear salary has increased like by 12%, you should exclude this 8.6%, which was recorded in 2022 average inflation. While, for example, for GDP, they are excluding this figure. So it's after inflation. But here's the thing, GDP is not directly connected to the well-being because technically GDP might grow while well-being might decrease.
You're talking about well-being of the common citizen.
Yeah. Well-being of citizens might be calculated through various indicators. But as of now, using the statistical approach which Armstat is using, the well-being should be calculated through the final consumption expenditures by the households. And this year it was like, if I'm not mistaken, after the inflation, it was like 7% or so, at least in 3 quarters of 2022. And this 7% show that it's not as high as economic growth per se. And out of this 7%, since we are talking about consumption, at least 1.5% should be excluded because it's due to influx of immigrants, and most probably even more because their consumption might be even higher, at least from the monetary point of view. From the financial point of view, their expenditures are higher. At least they are renting flats, which only rent has contributed to Armenian GDP, most probably a significant amount. So anyway, I think that the quality of life has increased in 2022, but not as much as the GDP. And I'm not completely sure that this increase is very consistent. So we should have more observations.
Yeah, we don't have the time to dig into each industry, which I think last time we talked, we mentioned that if you look at the industries, the growth is very spotty. For example, the agriculture was actually in recession, decreasing. Meanwhile, mining and IT had a different story. So it's very spotty overall. All right, let's wrap up our topics here. I'd like to ask each of you if there's been something on your mind this past week that you would like to talk about. Hrant?
I remember that there was a poll issued by MPG. I cited it while talking about Ruben Vardanyan. But it's interesting that this poll was mostly about the Russia-Ukraine war. And we have seen significant change in public opinion in December 2022 compared to March or April 2022, when in March or April, Armenian public opinion was generally supporting Russia, while now it's mostly opposing Russia. And the switch have been very significant. Then they, let's say, for example, the 45% of Armenian citizens considered the Russian war in Ukraine as just in beginning of April, while in beginning of December, only 20% considers this war just. And in many other issues like who is expected to win this war, the opinion has shifted. But not only that, the approach towards foreign partnership has changed as well, because now pro-Russian and pro-American approach is more or less has the same percentage. 17% consider that Armenia should have pro-Russian foreign policy, and 15.5% consider that Armenia should have pro-American foreign policy, and many other shifts, which are generally caused by the developments in 2022, both in Ukraine and in South Caucasus, but also, and to very significant portion, by the media policy, which was held by this government. And these statements by Pashinyan also support this view, because he is making statements after rather long-term preparation of public opinion, and this is already a result of this media work. So this is also important trend to track in 2023, because it's directly connected to the foreign politics, but also it's connected to the way Russia is approaching the situation is in Ukraine, whether it is able to handle it somehow, whether it is able to stabilize or to stop the military activities, or if it is not able, where will the front line move? Because they wanted to stop it, but they were not able. Kiev refused until Russia leaves all the territories, including Crimea. So this is very important story to track. And I think Ukrainian track is affecting Armenia in a much sharper way than is seen in Armenia. And the biggest issue for Armenia is an ongoing conflict itself, the military activities, because Russia is completely taken by these activities and does not put much attention to the South Caucasus. So I think this is very important story to track.
I'm glad you brought up this MPG issue because it was one of our topics, but then we had decided that maybe we didn't have time to tackle it. So I'm really glad you took it up. Hovik, what's on your mind?
Well, I mean, I think it's the same issue that we talked about, the Ruben Vardanyan affair. It's 35 days of blockade on top of the 2 years of constant threats by Azerbaijan, as if those are not enough to keep us all on pins and needles and basically terrorized day in and day out. I just can't see the logic behind this political infighting in Artsakh. I wish that our leadership, both in Artsakh and in Armenia, would get its act together. We are seriously at the precipice of that immortal question: to be or not to be. And I want to be. Let me just put it this way, as an Armenian. So I hope that we can all. I just hope that we get our act together and unite and get out of this mess that we're in, which is going to take a long time.
All right. We're going to leave it there for today. Thank you, Hrant. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks, Hrant.
That's our show this week. We hope you found it informative. Now go find us on social media and follow us. We'll talk to you next week.